I never believed in fate until the day I found that tunnel. For 37 years, I'd lived on the same farm my grandfather built in 1952, working the same fields, sleeping in the same house, and storing hay in the same old barn that had weathered countless storms. Everything about my life was predictable, routine, and exactly how I liked it. The first sign that something was different came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on the livestock and inspecting the buildings for winter preparations, when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was coming from beneath the barn floor, a sound like distant voices, muffled and indistinct, but unmistakably human. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks through the old wooden boards, or maybe mice scurrying around in the foundation. The barn was over 70 years old after all, and old buildings make all sorts of strange noises. But as I stood there listening, the sounds became more distinct, more purposeful, like people having a conversation somewhere far below my feet. I'd grown up in that barn, spent countless hours playing in the hayloft as a child, helped my father repair every board and beam. I knew every creak, every groan, every sound that old structure. This was something entirely different, something that shouldn't exist. My practical mind tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was the neighbor's radio carrying through some acoustic quirk of the landscape. Perhaps there was a problem with the water pipes running beneath the foundation. But deep down, I knew I was grasping at explanations that didn't quite fit. The sounds continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as they had begun. I stood there for another 20 minutes, straining to hear anything else, but the barn had returned to its normal silence. Still, something had changed. The familiar space suddenly felt different, charged with possibility and mystery. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those voices, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The next morning, I returned to the barn with a new sense of purpose. If there really were sounds coming from beneath the floor, I was going to find their source. I brought my toolbox, a flashlight, and a determination to solve this mystery once and for all. I started by examining every inch of the barn floor, looking for anything unusual or out of place. Most of the flooring was original hardwood planks, worn smooth by decades of use. But in the far corner near the old field, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. Several boards seemed slightly different from the others. Newer, perhaps, or cut to different dimensions. As I knelt down to examine these boards more closely, I realized they weren't nailed down like the rest of the floor. Instead, they were held in place by a clever system of wooden pegs that could be removed if you knew what to look. My grandfather had been a meticulous craftsman, but this level of hidden engineering seemed unusual even for him. Working carefully, I managed to remove the pegs and lift the suspicious boards. What I found underneath took my breath away. Instead of the dirt foundation I expected, there was a carefully constructed stone-lined opening that led down into darkness. The stonework was old but expertly crafted, with each block fitted perfectly against its neighbors. I shined my flashlight down into the opening and saw rough-hewn stone steps descending into what appeared to be a tunnel. The air that rose from below was cool and carried a faint scent of earth, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of old books or preserved wood. My heart was racing as I realized that this tunnel had been hidden beneath my barn for who knows how long. My grandfather had built this barn in 1952, which meant he either knew about the tunnel and built around it, or he had constructed it himself for reasons I couldn't imagine. The practical part of my mind warned me to be cautious, to call someone for help, to think this through carefully. But curiosity was stronger than caution, and I found myself gathering supplies for an exploration that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and my property. Chapter 3. Preparing for descent. I spent the rest of that day gathering everything I thought I might need for exploring the tunnel. I found my old camping gear, including a reliable headlamp and backup flashlights, rope in case I needed to climb back out, and my cell phone, though I doubted it would get signal underground. Before descending, I tried to research any historical information about tunnels in our area. Our farm was located in rural Pennsylvania, not far from areas that had been active in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War era. The possibility that my family's property had been involved in helping enslaved people escape to freedom was both thrilling and sobering. I also called my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in the area longer than anyone else I knew. Without revealing exactly what I'd found, I asked her if she remembered anything unusual about my grandfather, or any stories about hidden passages in the area. "Your grandfather was a secretive man," she told me over the phone. always working on projects he wouldn't talk about, always seemed to know things about local history that the rest of us didn't. My late husband used to joke that Thomas kept more secrets than the government. Her words only deepened the mystery. My grandfather had died when I was 12, and while I remembered him as a kind but quiet man, I'd never thought of him as particularly secretive. Now I was beginning to wonder how well I'd really known him. That evening, I stood at the edge of the tunnel opening, headlamp secured, rope tied around my waist and anchored to a support beam. The stone steps looked solid enough, but I had no idea how far they descended, or what I might find at the bottom. Taking a deep breath, I placed my foot on the first step and began my descent into the unknown. The temperature dropped noticeably as I went deeper, and the walls seemed to close in around me. After about 20 steps, the stairway leveled out into a proper tunnel, carved through solid rock and lined with the same expert stonework I'd seen at the entrance. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, and I realized that whatever my grandfather had been hiding, it was much bigger than I had imagined. Chapter 4. The Underground Passage. The tunnel was larger than I had expected, easily wide enough for two people to walk side by side, with a ceiling high enough that I didn't need to duck. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Every stone fitted perfectly, with no mortar visible between the joints. Whoever had built this passage had been both skilled and patient. As I walked deeper into the tunnel, my headlamp beam revealed details that spoke of careful planning and long-term use. There were small alcoves carved into the walls at regular intervals, some containing the remains of old oil lamps or candles. The floor was worn smooth in the center, suggesting that many people had walked this path over the years. About 50 yards from the entrance, I came to a wider chamber that served as a junction point. 3 passages branched off from this central space, each heading in a different direction. On the wall, carved into the stone itself, was a date, 1857. Below it, in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Freedom's Path," and a series of symbols I didn't recognize. The discovery of that date changed everything. 1857 was well before my grandfather was born, which meant this tunnel system was much older than I had imagined. It also placed its construction squarely in the era of the Underground Railroad, confirming my suspicions about its original purpose. I chose the passage that seemed to head toward the main road, and continued my exploration. This tunnel was slightly narrower than the main passage, but equally well constructed. After another 100 yards, I began to see light ahead. Not electric light, but the gray light of daylight filtering down from above. The tunnel ended at another stone stairway that led up to what appeared to be a concealed exit. Climbing carefully, I found myself looking up at a wooden trapdoor that was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. When I pushed it open, I emerged in a small clearing about a quarter mile from my barn, in a spot I had walked past countless times without ever noticing anything unusual. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, I realized that my property contained not just a tunnel, but an entire underground network that had been used to transport people to safety more than 150 years ago. My grandfather hadn't built this system. He had inherited it, maintained it, and kept its secrets until his death. Chapter 5. Family Secrets Revealed. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd discovered. The tunnel system was clearly part of the Underground Railroad, but why had my grandfather kept it secret? And more importantly, what else didn't I know about my family's history? I decided to search through the old documents and papers that had been stored in our attic since my grandfather's death. I'd never bothered to go through them thoroughly before, but now I was looking for any clue that might explain the tunnel's existence and my family's connection to it. In a dusty trunk, I found a collection of letters, photographs, and documents that painted a picture of my family I'd never known existed. There were letters from people thanking my great-great-grandfather for his assistance in their journey to freedom, photographs of groups of people standing near what I now recognized as the tunnel entrance, and detailed maps showing the entire underground network. One letter, dated 1858, was particularly revealing. It was from a man named Samuel who wrote, "The passage you provided saved not only my life, but the lives of my wife and children. We will never forget the courage you showed in helping strangers find their way to freedom." But the most shocking discovery was a journal kept by my grandfather himself, documenting how he had maintained and occasionally used the tunnel system well into the 1960s. The entries revealed that the tunnels hadn't been abandoned after the Civil War. They had continued to serve people seeking safety and freedom, including refugees from various conflict and people fleeing domestic violence. My grandfather's final entry, dated just months before his death, read, "The tunnels have served their purpose for over a century, helping those who needed safe passage to find it. I pray that someday they will no longer be necessary, but until that day comes, they will remain ready." I have not told Thomas about this legacy yet. He is still too young to understand the weight of such secrets. When he is ready, the tunnels will reveal themselves to him. Reading those words, I realized that my discovery hadn't been an accident. Somehow, my grandfather had known that I would find the tunnels when the time was right, when I was ready to understand and continue the family tradition of helping those in need. Chapter 6. The network expands. Over the next several days, I explored the other passages branching off from the central chamber. Each tunnel led to a different location, creating a network that connected my property to several neighboring farms, and even to the basement of what was now an abandoned church in town. The scope of the operation was staggering. This wasn't just a simple tunnel. It was a sophisticated transportation system that had been carefully planned and constructed to move people safely across miles of countryside without detection. The engineering alone represented years of work by skilled craftsmen who understood both construction and the need for absolute secrecy. In one of the side chambers, I found evidence that the tunnels had been used as recently as the 1980s. There were modern supplies, flashlights, batteries, canned food, and blankets, along with a logbook documenting the passage of various individuals and families. The entries were written in my grandfather's handwriting, but they described helping people I'd never heard mention. One entry from 1983 read, "Maria and her 3 children passed through safely tonight. They're fleeing domestic violence and need to reach the women's shelter in the next county without being followed. The tunnels provided the security they needed to travel undetected." Another, from 1979, Vietnamese refugee family used the passage to avoid immigration officials who were threatening deportation. Connected them with the church network that will help them establish legal residency. I was beginning to understand that my grandfather hadn't just maintained a historical artifact. He had continued to operate an active underground railroad that helped people in crisis well into the modern era. The realization that this had been happening on my property, under my nose, for my entire childhood, was both humbling and overwhelming. As I read through years of entries, I began to see my quiet, reserved grandfather in an entirely new light. He hadn't been secretive. He had been protective, safeguarding not just the physical tunnels, but the trust that vulnerable people had placed in. Chapter 7. Modern Implications. The discovery of my grandfather's continued use of the tunnels into the 1980s raised important questions about what I should do with this knowledge. The network was still intact, still functional, and in a world where people continued to face persecution and danger, still potentially necessary. I researched current laws regarding harboring refugees and people fleeing domestic violence. The legal landscape was complex, with federal, state, and local regulations that sometimes conflicted with each other. What had been clearly moral and necessary during the Civil War era was now tangled in immigration law, housing regulations, and liability concerns. But as I continued reading my grandfather's journals, I found evidence that he had worked with legitimate organizations, churches, women's shelters, refugee assistance groups, to ensure that the help he provided was both legal and effective. He hadn't been operating as a lone vigilante, but as part of a network of people committed to helping those in need within the bounds of the law. One journal entry from 1975 particularly impressed me. Contacted the Methodist Church about the family hiding in Tunnel Section C. Pastor Williams confirms they have legal refugee status but need temporary housing while their paperwork is processed. Arranged safe transport to the church's temporary housing program. My grandfather had been careful to verify that the people he helped were legitimate refugees or victims who needed assistance, and he had worked with established organizations to provide that help legally and safely. The tunnels had been just one tool in a larger network of compassion and assistance. This discovery forced me to confront a difficult question. Should I continue this family tradition? In a world where people still faced persecution, violence, and displacement, was there still a role for the underground network my ancestors had built and maintained? Chapter 8. Connecting with history. I decided to reach out to local historical societies and Underground Railroad researchers to learn more about the network I'd discovered. What I found was that my family's tunnel system was part of a much larger historical picture that had been largely forgotten or overlooked. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a historian at the nearby university who specialized in Underground Railroad research, was fascinated by my discovery. When I showed her photographs of the tunnels and some of my grandfather's documentation, she became visibly excited. "This is extraordinary," she told me during our first meeting. "We've suspected that there was Underground Railroad activity in this area, but we've never found physical evidence this well preserved. Your family's records could help us understand how these networks operated and evolved over time." Dr. Martinez explained that many Underground Railroad sites had been lost to development or deliberately concealed by families who feared legal repercussions. The fact that my family had maintained and documented their involvement for over a century made our tunnels historically significant. She also confirmed my suspicions about the continued use of such networks in modern times. "What your grandfather was doing wasn't unusual," she explained. "Many families who had been involved in the Underground Railroad continued to help people in crisis throughout the 20th century. The methods evolved, but the commitment to helping those in need remained constant." Through Dr. Martinez, I connected with other families in the region who had similar histories. I learned about a network of people who had quietly maintained underground railroad sites and continued to use them to help refugees, domestic violence victims, and others who needed safe passage or temporary shelter. These conversations helped me understand that I wasn't alone in grappling with the question of how to honor this legacy. Other families had faced similar decisions about whether and how to continue traditions of assistance that had been passed down through generations. Chapter 9. The Weight of Responsibility. As I learned more about the history and significance of what I discovered, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just my property or my family's secret anymore. It was a piece of American history that had implications for how we understand both our past and our present. The tunnels represented more than just a clever engineering solution to a historical problem. They embodied a commitment to human dignity and compassion that had motivated ordinary people to take extraordinary risks to help others. My ancestors hadn't been famous abolitionists or civil rights leaders. They had been farmers and craftsmen who believed that helping people in crisis was simply the right thing to do. But with that legacy came difficult questions about my own responsibility. If I chose to maintain the tunnels as a historical site, I would be preserving an important piece of history, but potentially abandoning the active mission that had defined their use for over a century. If I chose to continue using them to help people in need, I would be honoring that mission, but taking on legal and personal risks that I wasn't sure I was prepared to handle. I spent weeks wrestling with these questions, reading everything I could find about Underground Railroad history, modern refugee assistance, and the legal frameworks that governed both. I consulted with lawyers, historians, social workers, and clergy members, trying to understand all the implications of the choices I faced. The turning point came when I received a call from Pastor Williams, the elderly minister whose father had worked with my grandfather in the 1970s. He had heard about my discovery through Dr. Martinez and wanted to share some additional perspective. "Your grandfather was one of the most principled men I ever knew," Pastor Williams told me. "He never acted without careful thought and prayer. He understood that helping people sometimes required taking risks, but he also understood that those risks had to be calculated and purposeful." Pastor Williams went on to explain that his father's church had maintained connections with refugee assistance organizations and domestic violence shelters throughout the region. "If you're thinking about continuing your grandfather's work," he said, "you don't have to do it alone." Chapter 10. Building Bridges. Pastor Williams's words opened up possibilities I hadn't considered. Instead of choosing between preserving history and continuing the mission, I could potentially do both by working with established organizations that shared my grandfather's commitment to helping people in crisis. I began meeting with representatives from refugee resettlement agencies, domestic violence shelters, and immigrant rights organizations. What I discovered was that while the specific challenges had evolved since my grandfather's time, the fundamental need for safe passage and temporary shelter remained as urgent as ever. Sarah Chen, the director of a regional refugee assistance organization, was particularly interested in the historical aspects of what I'd found. Understanding how these networks operate in the past can help us improve how we help people today, she explained. "Your grandfather's documentation could provide valuable insights into effective assistance strategies." Through these conversations, I began to see a path forward that honored both the historical significance of the tunnels and their practical mission. Working with established organizations, I could potentially use the tunnels for educational purposes, while also supporting modern efforts to help refugees and domestic violence victims through legal and appropriate channels. The plan that emerged was multifaceted. The tunnels would be preserved and documented as a historical site, with portions open for educational tours and research. At the same time, I would work with partner organizations to support their assistance efforts, using my property as a meeting place and coordination center for legal aid, counseling services, and temporary housing assistance. This approach would allow me to continue my family's tradition of helping those in need, while ensuring that all assistance provided would be legal, safe, and effective. The tunnels themselves would serve primarily as a powerful reminder of the courage and passion that had motivated previous generations to help people in crisis. Dr. Martinez agreed to help with the historical documentation and preservation efforts. Pastor Williams offered to connect me with the regional network of churches and community organizations that provided assistance to refugees and domestic violence victims. Sarah Chen's organization agreed to provide training and support to ensure that any assistance I provided would meet current professional standards. Chapter 11. The Letter's Wisdom. As we began the restoration work, I found one final surprise in my grandfather's desk. A letter addressed to me, sealed, and marked, "To be opened when the tunnels are found." In the letter, my grandfather explained his decision to keep the tunnels secret during my childhood, and his hope that I would eventually discover them when I was mature enough to understand their significance. "Thomas, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you have found the tunnels and begun to understand the role our family has played in helping those who needed safe passage. I have watched you grow into a man of conscience and compassion, and I believe you are ready to decide how this legacy should continue. He went on to explain his own journey of discovery, describing how he had learned about the tunnels from his father, and gradually understood their historical significance and ongoing relevance. Each generation has faced different challenges and opportunities, he wrote. The methods of assistance have evolved, but the fundamental commitment to helping those in need has remained constant. The letter included practical advice about maintaining the tunnels, legal considerations for providing assistance, and contact information for organizations and individuals who had worked with our family. But more importantly, it provided moral guidance about the principles that should guide any decisions I made. Remember, my grandfather wrote, that the tunnels themselves are not what matters most. They are simply tools that have been used to express deeper values, compassion, courage, and the belief that all people deserve safety and dignity. How you choose to express those values in your own time and circumstances is up to you. He concluded with words that would guide my thinking for years to come. The greatest honor you can give to those who built and maintained these tunnels is to continue their work of helping others, whether that means preserving their history, continuing their mission, or finding new ways to serve those in need. Trust your conscience, seek wise counsel, and remember that small acts of courage can change lives. Reading my grandfather's letter gave me the clarity I had been seeking. I didn't have to choose between preserving history and continuing the mission. I could do both by finding ways to honor the past while addressing present needs. Chapter 12. A new chapter begins today. 3 years after I first heard those mysterious voices beneath my barn floor, the tunnel system serves multiple purposes that honor both its history and its ongoing mission. The main passage has been converted into an educational site where school groups and researchers can learn about Underground Railroad history and the courage of ordinary people who risked everything to help others. The side chambers